I stood outside my own daughter's house in the middle of January, in -18, and I could see the lights on inside. I could hear laughter through the front door. I knocked again. Nothing. I knew they were home. Nora's car was in the driveway. So was Conrad's truck. I'd driven 4 hours from Sudbury for this, for my granddaughter Ivy's 6th birthday party. I'd bought her a wooden art set from that little shop on Elgin Street she'd been asking about for months. It was wrapped in yellow paper with a bow she could keep. The door opened, finally. It was Conrad. My son-in-law. He looked at me the way you look at a stranger who's rung the wrong bell. "Harold," he said. "Not Dad. Never Dad. We weren't expecting you today. It's Ivy's birthday," I said. "We're doing a small thing. Just close family." I stood there in the cold and I said, "I am her grandfather." He looked at me for a long moment, then stepped back just enough to let me through the door. Not wide. Just enough. Like he was already doing me a favor. I should have paid attention to that moment. I should have understood, right then, what the next 2 years were going to look like. I'll start from the beginning. My name is Harold. I'm 67 years old, born and raised in Sudbury, Ontario. I spent 31 years working as a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction company, the kind of work that ages your knees before your face. My wife Edna passed away 11 years ago from a brain aneurysm, 4 days after she complained of a headache. 48 years old. There was nothing anyone could have done, the doctors said. I've spent years trying to believe them. We had 2 children. My son Jeffrey, who lives in Vancouver now and calls me every Sunday without fail. And my daughter Nora. Nora, who was always the one I worried about most, not because she was difficult, but because she wanted so badly to be loved by the right kind of people, and she didn't always choose wisely. She met Conrad when she was 32. He was charming the way a car salesman is charming. All warmth, no substance. He told stories about himself constantly. His deals, his wins, his instincts. I once sat through an entire Thanksgiving dinner listening to Conrad explain to the table why he was the only person at his former company who truly understood the market. Edna had always said to give him time, that he was still finding himself. Edna was always more generous than me. Conrad worked in real estate development. Not the stable kind. The speculative kind, where you're always one project away from either retiring at 50 or declaring bankruptcy. He'd had some success in his late 30s, bought and flipped properties in the Waterloo region before that market went crazy. Made enough to feel like a genius, which is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a man like Conrad. Nora worked as a dental hygienist. She was good at it, practical, steady. She'd bought her own condo before they got together. She'd saved. She was more like me than she knew, or wanted to admit. They had Ivy in 2018, a sweet, curious little girl who liked to draw horses and ask questions I didn't always know how to answer. I drove down to Kitchener-Waterloo, where they'd settled, as often as I could. Every few months, sometimes more, I took Ivy to the Science Center in Toronto once, just the 2 of us, and she talked about it for 6 months afterward. Things were fine. Not perfect, but fine. And then they weren't. It started, I think, with Conrad's development project in Cambridge. He'd partnered with 2 other investors on a small commercial conversion, turning an old textile building into mixed-use residential units. The kind of project that looks good on paper and goes sideways on execution. I don't know the full details of what went wrong, because Conrad never told me, and Nora only told me pieces. What I know is that by late 2021, the project was significantly over budget, and one of the partners had pulled out. Conrad needed capital. I didn't find out he was having problems until Nora called me one evening, and her voice was the voice I remembered from when she was a teenager trying to explain a bad decision. "Dad," she said, "Conrad and I want to talk to you about something. About an opportunity." They drove up to Sudbury that weekend. Conrad laid it out at my kitchen table, with a printed document and a pen already uncapped. He wanted me to invest $250,000 into the Cambridge project, as a private lender. My money would be secured against the property, he said. I'd get 8% interest annually, and when the project sold, I'd get my principal back plus a percentage of the profits. I'm not a sophisticated investor. I'm a retired construction supervisor. But I knew enough to ask questions. I asked about the other partners. I asked about the timeline. I asked about what happened if the project didn't sell at the projected price. Conrad had an answer for everything. Smooth, confident, a little impatient. Like I was wasting his time by being careful with my life savings. Nora sat beside him and said, almost quietly, "Dad, it would really help us." That was what got me. Not the 8%, not the collateral. It would really help us. She was my daughter. She'd lost her mother at 21. She'd built a decent life and now her husband was in trouble, and she was scared. I signed. I transferred $250,000 from an investment account I'd been building since I was 34. Money I'd saved through overtime and lean Christmases and a decade of packed lunches. Edna and I had always planned to use it for our retirement, for travel, maybe for a little place on a lake. She never got to see it spent. Now it was going into a commercial conversion project in Cambridge that I'd never visited and didn't fully understand. Conrad shook my hand and said it was going to change everything for our family. I drove them out to their car afterward, and Nora hugged me at the driveway. She felt thin. I held on longer than usual. That night I sat in my kitchen for a long time with the lights off. The next 18 months were quiet. Conrad sent me quarterly statements, documents with numbers on them that I read carefully and understood only partially. The project was progressing, he said. There were delays, of course. Supply chain issues, permitting, the usual. I'd worked in construction long enough to know that delays were real, so I accepted this. Nora and I still talked regularly. She'd bring Ivy over once or twice a year. Things felt normal enough that I started to trust that I hadn't made a mistake. But calls started spacing out. The quarterly statements came late, then stopped. When I asked Conrad about updates, he'd reply with a few lines by email, and then go quiet for weeks. In January of 2023, I drove down for Ivy's birthday and was left standing in the cold on the porch. I noticed, that day, that the house felt different. Colder, even indoors. Nora was warm enough with me but distracted, moving in and out of the room like she was being careful about something. Conrad barely spoke to me. At one point he left the room mid-conversation and didn't come back. Ivy climbed into my lap while the other kids ran around the living room, and she whispered to me that she'd missed me. I told her I'd missed her too. I told her she could call me anytime she wanted. She said, "Mommy said you've been busy." I hadn't been busy. I'd been waiting for a call. I drove back to Sudbury that evening with the yellow wrapping paper from her gift folded on the passenger seat. I don't know why I kept it. I just couldn't throw it away. In March, I called Nora and told her I needed an update on the investment. Not because I was desperate, but because I deserved to know. $250,000 was not money you stop asking about. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, Conrad will reach out soon. He's dealing with a lot right now." I said, "What does that mean, Nora?" "Dealing with what?" She said she couldn't really get into it. She said she was sorry. I called Conrad directly. He didn't answer. I left a message. He texted me back 2 days later. "Harold, the project hit some complications. I'll be in touch as soon as I have something concrete to tell you." I waited 2 more months. Then I called a lawyer. Her name was Susan Park, a real estate solicitor in Sudbury, who a colleague had used years ago for a property dispute. I brought her everything I had: the investment agreement, the quarterly statements, the property address. She reviewed it over 2 appointments, and then she looked at me across her desk and said, carefully, "Harold, the terms of this agreement are not as strong as you would want them to be. The security on the property was filed informally. If that property has been refinanced, or if there are prior charges, your position could be quite vulnerable." I asked her what that meant in plain language. She said it meant that if the project had gone badly, I might be at the back of a very long line. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked her to help me find out exactly where I stood. What she found took several weeks to uncover. The Cambridge building had been sold to a new buyer in December of 2022. 4 months before I was still receiving statements suggesting it was under development. The sale had gone through at a loss. The mortgage lender had been paid out first. There were other creditors. By the time anyone got to my informal lien, there was nothing left. $250,000. Gone, and Conrad had known. He had known since December, and he had not told me. He had sat across from me at Ivy's birthday party, barely speaking, while I sat in his house with a birthday present for my granddaughter, and he had said nothing. I drove down to Kitchener unannounced the following Saturday. I want to be very clear about what I was not. I was not a man coming to shout or threaten or break something. I was 66 years old. I'd spent my life building things, not destroying them. I just needed to look at Conrad and hear him explain it to me. I needed him to say the words out loud. He opened the door and his face changed the moment he saw me. Just slightly, just enough. I said, "The Cambridge property sold in December, Conrad." He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Harold, this isn't really the time." I said, "It's been the time for 6 months." He let me in. We sat in the kitchen. Nora came downstairs and stood in the doorway with her arms folded, and she looked at me like she was bracing for something painful. Conrad explained it badly. He talked about circumstances and market conditions and unforeseen complications. He used the word technically several times, which is the word people use when they know they've done something wrong but want to make it sound procedural. He said my money was gone, yes, but that it wasn't anyone's fault. He said he'd make it up to me when the next project came through. I looked at Nora while he was talking. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I said, "You knew," she said, "Dad." I said, "You knew when I came for Ivy's birthday." She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. I stood up from the table. I picked up my jacket, and I said, as calmly as I could manage, "I want it in writing, Conrad, all of it. What happened, when you knew, and what's owed to me, in writing." This week, he said he'd have to talk to his lawyer. I said, "You do that." I walked out to my car and sat in it for a while before I started driving. It was a cold day, flat gray sky, the kind of day southern Ontario does in April. A dog was barking somewhere down the street. A kid was riding a bike on the sidewalk. The world was just going on, the way it does. The written accounting never came. What came instead, 3 weeks later, was a phone call from Nora. She said she needed to talk to me about something difficult. I said, "Go ahead." She said that she and Conrad thought it might be better, for now, if we took a little space. She said things were very stressful at home, and my calls were adding to that stress, and she thought it would help everyone if I stepped back for a while. I said, "Nora, he took my retirement savings." She said she understood I felt that way. I said, "I don't feel that way. That is what happened." She started crying. "And I want to tell you something about hearing your daughter cry. It does something to you that no other sound in the world does. It doesn't matter how old she is or what the argument is about. It pulls at a part of you that formed when she was an infant and never went away." I did not hang up angry. I told her I loved her. I told her that didn't change. I said I'd give her some time. Then I called Susan Park and told her to pursue the recovery formally. Susan was straightforward with me about the odds. Civil litigation for an informally secured private loan against a defendant with no obvious assets was not a slam dunk. It was expensive, slow, and uncertain. She said we could probably establish that Conrad had concealed material information from me, which could give rise to an action for negligent misrepresentation or potentially fraud. Whether I'd collect anything was a different question. I told her to proceed. I also called Jeffrey in Vancouver. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, which was always his way, and then he was quiet for a moment and said, "Dad, I'll fly out." I told him not to. I told him I was okay. He said, "I know you're okay. I want to come anyway." He came the next weekend. We drove out to Killarney Provincial Park on Saturday, the way we used to do when the kids were small, and we walked along the La Cloche Ridge Trail without talking much. And at some point he said, she was always going to choose him, you know, when it came down to it. I didn't say anything. He said, "That's not a reflection of how much she loves you, it's just who she is." I've thought about that a lot since. While Susan worked through the legal channels, I started to take stock of what I had. The house in Sudbury was paid off. I'd owned it outright for 12 years. I had a modest pension from the construction company, a CPP payment that wasn't going to make me rich but would keep me stable, and a smaller investment account I hadn't touched. What I'd lost was the cushion, the plan, the version of retirement where I had options. I was not destitute, but I was not where I should have been. I made changes quietly. I took on part-time work consulting on a couple of local construction projects. Nothing heavy, just oversight and assessment, the kind of work my knees could handle. I cut back where I could. I sold my second vehicle. I looked at my life very honestly, and I asked myself what actually mattered, and I tried to build from that answer outward instead of mourning what was gone. The legal process moved slowly. It took 11 months before we reached a hearing. Conrad, by then, had dissolved the LLC he'd been operating under and was working under a new corporate structure. His own personal assets were limited. The house was in Nora's name from before their marriage, which I hadn't known. The judgment, when it came, was in my favor. $168,000 plus costs. Collecting it was another matter, but it was a start. I didn't hear from Nora for almost 8 months. Then one evening in November, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Grandpa, it's Ivy. Mom doesn't know I'm texting. I found your number in Mom's old phone. I miss you. Are you okay?" She was 8 years old. 8 years old, with her mother's old phone, sending a text in secret because she missed her grandfather. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. I read it 3 times. I texted back, "Ivy, I'm so glad you reached out. I'm okay. I miss you very much. How are you, sweetheart?" We texted back and forth for 20 minutes. She told me about school, about a horse she'd seen at a farm near their house, about a book she was reading. She asked if I would come to her school concert in December. She said it was on the 14th, a Friday. I said I would try. I didn't know if Nora would let me in the door. I called Nora the next day. I didn't mention the text from Ivy. I just called and said I thought it was time we talked, if she was willing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." We met at a coffee shop in Guelph, halfway between our cities, a week later. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and hadn't told anyone. We sat with our coffees and neither of us spoke for a bit, and then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have told you sooner." I said, "Yes, you should have." She told me what she could. Conrad's project had collapsed in the autumn of 2022. He'd told her in October. She'd wanted to call me, but he'd convinced her to wait until there was something more concrete to say, until he had a plan. And then it was December, and then it was January, and she was standing in her kitchen at Ivy's birthday party, watching me walk through her door with a wrapped present, and she couldn't make herself say the words. I said, "You could have," she said. "I know. I was a coward." There's not a lot of good ways to respond to your daughter calling herself a coward. I told her I understood fear. I told her I had made my own mistakes under pressure, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I told her that what her husband did was not her fault, even if her silence had made it worse. She looked at me with her mother's eyes and she said, "I filed for divorce in September." I didn't say anything. She said, "It's been done for a while. I just didn't know how to tell you." I reached across the table and took her hand. She started crying properly, the way she hadn't in years. I let her cry. I didn't try to fix it. After a while I said, "Are you and Ivy going to be okay?" She said, "We're going to be okay." I went to the school concert on December 14th. I drove down on the Friday afternoon, checked into a motel on the edge of town, and showed up at the school gym at 6:30 with a program I'd been given at the door. I was early. I sat in the 4th row on the left side and watched the room fill up. Nora came in about 10 minutes before it started. She saw me and she walked over and sat down in the empty seat beside me. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. When Ivy walked out on stage with the rest of her class, she was wearing a green sweater, and her hair was in 2 braids the way Edna used to do Nora's hair when she was small. She was scanning the audience, and then she found me. She waved with her whole arm the way children do, unself-conscious and urgent, like she was afraid I might not see her. I waved back. I put both hands up the way she did. She laughed. I hadn't heard her laugh in person in almost a year. Conrad eventually settled a portion of the judgment. Not the full amount, but $70,000, which came through the following spring during the divorce proceedings. My lawyer said it was probably the best we were going to do given his financial situation. I took it. There was no satisfaction in it, not really. It wasn't about the money by then. It had never fully been about the money, though it had taken me a while to understand that. What it had always been about was this. I wanted my family back. Not the version where everything was fine and no one had made any mistakes. Not a family that didn't have any damage in it. Families always have damage. I know that. Edna and I had our own hard years, our own silences, our own things we weren't proud of. What I wanted was just to be present. to sit at the table, to hear Ivy laugh, to be in the room when things happened. Nora and Ivy moved into a rental house in Guelph after the divorce came through. It was a small house on a quiet street, with a backyard and a garage and a maple tree that dropped more leaves than any tree I'd ever encountered. I drove down to help them move in on a Saturday in August. Jeffrey flew out from Vancouver, and the three of us carried boxes and assembled furniture, while Ivy directed us importantly from doorways about which room things should go in. At the end of the day, we sat on the back steps, with takeout containers from a Thai place nearby, and Ivy fell asleep between Nora and me with her head on my shoulder, and the backyard was full of fireflies. I don't know if I'm a wise man. The name of this channel would suggest that I'm supposed to be, but I sat on those steps that evening with my daughter on one side and my granddaughter asleep against me, and I thought, you didn't lose this. Even when it felt like you had. You didn't lose this. Some things you have to fight for, quietly, with patience, without raising your voice, without burning the world down even when you want to. I thought about Conrad wherever he was. I thought about the signed paper at my kitchen table, and Edna's money, and the yellow wrapping paper on the passenger seat. And then I stopped thinking about Conrad. Because the fireflies were going on and off in the dark, and Ivy was breathing the slow, deep breath of a sleeping child, and Nora leaned her head on my other shoulder, and the evening was warm. Some evenings are worth everything it took to get to them.